I'm with the media.
Out! You are trespassing! Get out!
I'm so sorry.
Get out!
The scene captured in the footage begins without urgency, almost deceptively still. The afternoon light stretches across the open country in a way that is familiar to anyone who has lived in regional South Australia. The air appears dry, almost pale, carrying that particular stillness found only in remote outback stations. In the distance, faint shapes of sheds and long fence lines can be made out, but they sit quietly, not drawing attention to themselves. The environment, open and silent, remains undisturbed, except for the low hum of wind that seems to pass between buildings without resistance. It is the kind of silence that holds weight in rural Australia, a silence shaped by distance, heat, and the understanding that neighbours may be tens of kilometres away. The veranda of the homestead is shaded by an overhanging roofline, creating a sharp contrast between light and shadow. Dust rests on the boards. A pair of boots sits near the doorway, left there sometime earlier in the day. There is no sudden movement in the opening seconds of the clip, only the sense that whoever is filming is waiting for someone to respond to their presence. The camera is steady enough to suggest the person recording is standing still, positioned only a few meters from the veranda. Although the lens does not reveal the exact distance, the angle makes it clear that the reporter has approached closer to the home than most rural families would expect without prior consent. From inside the house, or perhaps from just beyond the frame, a subtle shift occurs. A figure steps into the light. It is a woman of older age, her posture shaped by years of physical work and the realities of life in the outback. She moves with purpose, not haste, but with a certainty that shows she is aware of the people standing in her space. In her hands is a shotgun, held naturally, as though it is an object she has used before in routine circumstances rather than in moments of confrontation. The barrel is angled forward. Her arms are firm but not trembling. Nothing in her movement suggests panic, yet there is tension in the way she stands. She is alert, protective, and visibly strained by the circumstances surrounding her. Her face carries signs of exhaustion, lines drawn deeper by worry, eyes that seem to have gone several nights without sleep. The absence of any theatrics is striking. She does not raise her voice beyond what is necessary. When she speaks, her tone is measured, low and direct. There is no flourish, no attempt to dramatize the situation. Her intention, at least in this moment, appears to be simply making it clear that the people before her should not be where they are. Her words are audible in the recording, delivered with steady firmness. Get out. You are trespassing. The delivery is unmistakably Australian in rhythm and clarity, the kind of cadence shaped by long distances and an expectation that people should respect boundaries without needing them repeated. The camera remains fixed on her. The silence that follows her command is heavy. The reporter does not immediately reply, and for a brief moment, neither side moves. It creates an almost suspended sensation, as though the audience viewing the clip is also standing there, uncertain about what will happen next. The woman's expression does not change. Her stance remains grounded on the veranda. She looks directly at the group in front of her, maintaining the boundary she has just voiced. She does not take a step forward, nor does she adjust the shotgun beyond holding it steady. There is no flinch, no escalation. The footage ends soon after, cutting off the remainder of the interaction. When the clip first appeared online, reactions were immediate. Many viewers did not recognize the subtleties of outback body language. Others had not encountered the social norms of remote station properties, where private land is treated with a seriousness that differs from urban areas. The sight of an elderly woman holding a firearm on her veranda, especially during a publicized search for a missing child, struck many as alarming. People commented on the tension they perceived. Some expressed confusion, some concern, and many admitted they could not make sense of the scene without further information. The absence of context in a short video clip was enough to generate debate among viewers who were seeing the moment through the filter of their own experiences rather than through the realities of life in remote Australia. What made this footage particularly compelling for online audiences was not only the imagery, but the timing of its release. The disappearance of a young child in a harsh environment had already placed attention on the family and the region. Emotions were heightened. People were searching for clues, explanations, patterns, anything that might shed light on what had happened. When the video surfaced, it naturally drew focus. It became a moment viewers could replay, pause, analyze, and discuss. Every movement in the clip, from the way the shotgun was held to the tone of the grandmother's voice, became subject to interpretation. It was not just a recording, it became a touchpoint, a reference that shaped much of the discussion that would follow. The veranda, with its dust and aging timber, takes on symbolic weight in this first impression. It becomes the backdrop against which the public observes a family in crisis, even if the clip does not explicitly show that crisis unfolding. The woman at the center of the frame, with the lines of fatigue marking her expression, becomes someone viewers feel they must understand, even though the video itself provides almost no information about her personal state beyond that single moment. The footage does not explain why she is holding a firearm. It does not reveal how long the reporters had been on the property. It does not communicate what the family had already endured. It merely presents a snapshot in time, narrow and incomplete, yet powerful enough to prompt widespread scrutiny. This moment on the veranda is important not because it offers answers, but because it raises a fundamental question that sits at the heart of the public's curiosity. Why would a grandmother, during an already distressing period, appear with a shotgun and confront a group of journalists? It is a question that seems simple on the surface, but becomes more complex when one considers the emotional, cultural, and environmental factors at play. The footage provides the image, but not the explanation. It shows the action, but not the reasoning behind it. In presenting this moment without broader interpretation, the purpose is not to judge or speculate. It is to establish the visual and emotional starting point from which the rest of the narrative will unfold. This event, brief and easily misunderstood, became the first reference point for much of the public conversation surrounding the case. The veranda, the wood beneath her feet, the stillness of the light, the presence of the firearm, and the measured command she issued, all serve as the initial frame through which viewers encountered the story. This fragment of video is where the inquiry begins, not where it ends. It is the opening moment that invites closer examination in the sections that follow, guided by context rather than assumption. Life in remote South Australia often asks more of its residents than those in urban areas may realise. For families who live on large pastoral stations, the environment shapes daily routines, responsibilities, and the expectations placed on each member of the household. The woman who appeared in the footage, known locally as a grandmother, has lived much of her life in this landscape. Her understanding of the land, the demands it places on people, and the rhythm of isolation is the result of decades spent tending to animals, managing long distances, and raising a family in a place where self-reliance is essential. Her days, even before the events surrounding her grandson, would have involved a mixture of physical labor, domestic care, and the constant awareness that help is rarely close by. Those familiar with outback communities often describe women of her generation as the quiet anchor of the property. They represent stability, taking on work that may not always be visible, yet forms the backbone of the household. A grandmother in this setting is not simply a figure of affection, but often a central pillar in the running of the station. She ensures meals are prepared, tracks are watched, children are supervised, and the daily ebb and flow of life remains steady. In many remote families, especially multi-generational ones, the older women provide continuity in times of uncertainty. Their presence carries weight, not only in terms of family dynamics, but in the sense of safety they bring to those around them. It is within this context that the grandmother's usual responsibilities and character must be understood. Those who know her speak of a woman who prefers practicality over discussion, someone who acts when action is needed and remains calm when situations escalate. Her decisions are shaped by years of responding to challenges without external assistance. This type of resilience is not uncommon among older women in remote Australia, where storms, animal threats, machinery failures, and medical emergencies are navigated with limited support. They are accustomed to stepping forward because waiting for someone else to act is not often an option. Their sense of duty is not dramatic, it is ingrained. When her grandson went missing, the emotional load placed upon her would have been profound. For anyone, the disappearance of a child sparks immediate fear and helplessness. For an older family member who has spent a lifetime caring for younger generations, that fear carries an additional layer. It is both protective and deeply personal. The days following the disappearance were marked by long hours, exhausting uncertainty, and the heavy stillness that settles over families waiting for news. The grandmother, like the rest of the household, would have been caught between moments of hope and the growing awareness of how unforgiving the land can be. Fatigue becomes a defining feature of crisis situations. Sleep is irregular, appetite shifts, small sounds become sharper. Moments that would ordinarily be manageable begin to feel overwhelming. For older individuals, the physical strain can be significant. The grandmother's posture and expression in the footage reflect this quiet exhaustion. There is no need for words to communicate it. The lines on her face, the way she carries her shoulders, and the measured way she speaks all indicate someone who has been holding herself together for longer than her body may allow. The burden of uncertainty settles differently on those who have already lived through decades of responsibility. They feel compelled to remain strong for others, even when their own emotional reserves are depleted. The psychological pressure of not knowing where a loved one is can sharpen instincts. In the days after Gus went missing, every unfamiliar noise, every unexplained movement near the property, and every vehicle approaching the homestead would understandably draw attention. Older family members often take on the role of monitoring the home during a crisis, partially out of habit and partially because it provides a sense of purpose in a situation where very little feels within their control. For a grandmother, stepping outside to check on activity around the house is a natural extension of her everyday role. She may not have the physical mobility of younger relatives, but she possesses experience that tells her when something feels out of place. This is why she became the one to respond when voices or footsteps were heard near the veranda. It was not an act of authority or confrontation, but an instinctive response from someone who has spent her life protecting her household. The appearance of strangers so close to the home, especially during an emotionally heightened period, would trigger immediate vigilance. Rural families are taught early to be aware of who comes onto their land. It is not about suspicion, it is about safety. On remote properties, unexpected visitors do not simply drop by. They are noticed, questioned, and assessed before being allowed any form of access. This cultural norm is understood across regional Australia, where privacy is respected as part of everyday life. As days pass without resolution, the emotional weight on a grandmother's shoulders becomes heavier than most outsiders can recognize. She is balancing grief, fear, exhaustion, and the compulsion to maintain order. Her mind is pulled between what has already happened and what might unfold. She is reliving the moment she last saw her grandson, replaying it in hopes of finding something missed. She is watching younger family members crumble under the stress. She is attempting to provide comfort while needing comfort herself. This internal conflict, silent and deeply human, shapes her behavior in ways that may not be immediately visible to those unfamiliar with crisis dynamics. Within Australian culture, especially in rural regions, grandmothers hold a distinctive position. They are seen as both protectors and caretakers. They may not dominate conversations or exhibit outward strength, but their presence carries authority born of life experience. They are often the emotional heart of the family, quietly absorbing distress while offering stability. When a grandmother steps forward, as she did on the veranda, it often reflects a deeply felt sense of responsibility. Her identity is tied to the well-being of those around her, and the loss of a grandchild strikes at the core of that identity. Understanding this cultural respect is crucial to understanding her behavior. This section does not attempt to explain the actions seen in the footage. It aims only to convey the weight she was carrying at the time, a weight defined by her role, her history, and the circumstances enveloping her family. Her presence on the veranda must be viewed through the lens of someone exhausted, protective, and emotionally stretched by an unfolding tragedy. The next part of the narrative will move outward from her inner burden, exploring how tools and routines in rural Australia influence responses in unexpected situations. In remote Australia, daily life is shaped by practical needs rather than symbolic actions. Tools are selected because they serve a specific purpose, and those who live on pastoral stations learn early that the land does not bend to convenience. Among these tools, the shotgun occupies a familiar and unembellished place. To people living on large properties, it is an item used for protection against environmental threats and for managing the everyday realities of rural work. For many households, especially those operating across thousands of hectares, a shotgun is no more unusual than a pair of work gloves or a length of fencing wire. The reason for this begins with the wildlife that inhabits the outback. South Australia's remote regions are home to some of the country's most resilient species, many of which pose risks to people, livestock, and working dogs. Snakes, particularly those common in warm, open areas, can move quietly across verandas, sheds, and stockyards without warning. Their presence requires immediate attention, not out of fear, but out of respect for how quickly they can endanger both adults and children. On a pastoral station, where the nearest ambulance or clinic may be hours away, preventing a bite is far more realistic than treating one. A shotgun is often the most effective means of dispatching a snake found too close to living spaces. Beyond snakes, predators such as foxes and dingoes regularly circle livestock operations. Lambs, calves, and smaller animals are vulnerable, and the financial impact of predation can accumulate faster than many urban viewers might expect. For a family working the land, protecting their animals is part of maintaining their livelihood. The use of a shotgun in these situations is not framed as aggression, but as a necessary measure to prevent loss. The responsibility to act swiftly falls on whoever is present at the time, whether that is a younger station hand or an older family member who has understood this routine for decades. In households like the one in this case, the grandmother has lived long enough to see generations come and go, each learning the same lessons about the land. She would have learned how to handle a firearm safely, when to use it, and when to keep it stored. The idea that she may have used a shotgun to deal with snakes or foxes in the past is not speculation. It is a standard part of station life. Rural families build a rhythm around these responsibilities. They know where the firearm is kept, how to load it, and how to discharge it responsibly. This knowledge is not treated with ceremony. It is passed down as part of being able to manage a household in isolation. For viewers based in metropolitan areas, the sight of an older woman holding a shotgun can trigger a different set of assumptions. In urban contexts, firearms are strongly associated with crime, intimidation, or extreme escalation. This association shapes public perception, particularly for those who rarely encounter guns outside of media portrayals. When the footage of the grandmother holding the shotgun began circulating online, these urban associations influenced how many interpreted the moment. The image appeared to suggest confrontation rather than routine, tension rather than practicality. This contrast between urban and rural perspectives highlights a significant cultural divide. In the outback, a firearm is neither an object of power nor a symbol of threat. It is simply one of the tools needed to maintain safety in an environment that can quickly turn unpredictable. For those who live there, the presence of a gun does not imply that something extraordinary is happening. Instead, it often suggests that something ordinary, like removing a snake from a doorway, is being dealt with efficiently. The absence of alarm in the grandmother's posture and tone supports this interpretation. She holds the shotgun with the ease of someone accustomed to using it for functional purposes. The misunderstanding that arose online was amplified by the lack of context in the clip. Without seeing the environment, the distances involved, or the wildlife risks present on a daily basis, the footage became detached from the world in which it was filmed. People unfamiliar with these realities began framing the moment as unusual or alarming. This framing gained traction as discussion spread, not because the behavior was out of place, but because the cultural lens through which it was viewed was disconnected from rural experience. The grandmother's actions were entirely consistent with rural norms, but this consistency was invisible to those who did not share the same background. Another factor worth considering is the role of instinct in rural households. When a sound is heard on the veranda, particularly during a stressful period, the response is straightforward. Someone goes to check. The person who checks is often the one most immediately available or most accustomed to responding. For this grandmother, stepping onto the veranda with a shotgun was likely a habitual response born of many similar moments. In remote settings, people do not assume that noises near their home are harmless. They investigate, not dramatically, but with the same practicality that guides the rest of their work. The presence of a shotgun in her hands does not change the nature of this instinct. It only reflects the tools she perceives as necessary. Viewers watching the footage for the first time saw a moment removed from its wider environment. The image of a grandmother holding a shotgun can be compelling in ways that rural families might find surprising. Yet the truth is far more grounded and far less dramatic. Firearms remain part of the toolkit that allows households to operate safely in remote Australia. Their use is regulated, familiar, and deeply integrated into station routines. To understand the grandmother's presence with the shotgun, one must begin with this fundamental truth. On a pastoral station, a shotgun is not an escalation. It is a solution. In presenting this perspective, the goal is not to justify or explain behavior beyond what is factual. It is to reframe how the moment is understood, shifting from assumptions shaped by urban expectations to the practical realities of outback life. The next section will move from the tool itself to the boundaries of rural properties, exploring why the veranda became a point of tension when unexpected visitors arrived. In remote Australia, boundaries are not symbolic. They are lived, understood, and respected in ways that differ sharply from urban expectations. The land itself shapes this understanding. When a property stretches over thousands of hectares and the nearest neighbor may be dozens of kilometers away, the idea of personal space takes on a more concrete meaning. A fence line, a gate, a track leading to a homestead, these are not casual markers. They are signals of entry, responsibility, and consent. Crossing them without permission carries consequences that go beyond etiquette. It touches on safety, privacy, and the fundamental trust required to live in isolation. For residents of the outback, the concept of trespass is not theoretical. It is woven into the rhythms of everyday life. A stranger approaching a homestead is not simply someone passing through, they are someone whose presence must be assessed, often quickly. Remote properties operate without the security layers that urban households take for granted. No nearby patrol cars, no neighbors close enough to notice unusual activity, no immediate backup if something goes wrong. People learn to rely on their own judgment, their own preparedness, and their own capacity to respond. Within this reality, the arrival of an uninvited person is not a small matter. It disrupts the sense of safety that families work hard to maintain. When journalists approached the Lamont family home during the search for the missing child, the distance between city norms and outback expectations became visible. The reporters stood within meters of the veranda, close enough that their presence would have been unmistakable. The camera footage shows them positioned directly in front of the home, well inside what any rural Australian would consider private space. They were not at the gate, not at the first clearing, not waiting for someone to meet them outside the house. They were already past the natural points where strangers are expected to pause and announce themselves. To the grandmother who stepped outside, their proximity would have registered immediately as a breach. On large properties, the family home functions as a sanctuary. It is not simply where people eat or sleep, it is the center of their sense of stability. Everything outside that immediate area is open, exposed, and demanding. The inside of the home and the veranda around it form the one controlled environment a family can depend upon. When someone crosses into that space uninvited, the boundary feels not just crossed, but violated. For older residents, this reaction is instinctive. Years of living without external security mean they have developed strong internal cues for when something feels wrong. Rural households have established ways of handling unexpected visitors. The first sign is usually the barking of working dogs, whose job includes alerting the family to movement near the house. If the dogs are quiet, the next clue may be the sound of tires on gravel or the crunch of boots on a dry pathway. In some families, a torch or spotlight is used at night to assess whether the person approaching is familiar. In others, someone steps out first to gauge what is happening. What is consistent across these scenarios is that the family remains in control of the encounter. They determine how close the visitor is allowed to get. They choose the distance at which communication begins. This approach is not rooted in aggression. It is rooted in precaution, formed by generations of people who could not rely on police arriving within minutes if something went wrong. The mental model differs from that of urban residents. In a city, seeing someone near your front door without invitation may be unsettling, but it is typically not viewed through the lens of immediate personal risk. In the outback, the calculation is different. A stranger close to the house may be lost, confused, or simply mistaken about where they are supposed to be. But they may also be someone whose intentions are unclear. The responsibility to determine that difference falls on the occupants of the home. This context makes the grandmother's verbal command understandable. When she told the reporters to leave and stated that they were trespassing, she was expressing a boundary that all remote families recognize and expect to be respected. There is nothing unusual about such a command. Its tone reflects the seriousness of the situation rather than hostility. Her focus was on reclaiming control of the space around the house, ensuring that those who had crossed into it understood they were not permitted to remain. The statement was clear, direct, and aligned with the expectations of rural etiquette. The specific position of the journalists in the footage reinforces this interpretation. They were not standing at a distance or calling out from a safer range. They were within the personal perimeter of the home, the area where only invited guests or family members would stand. For any resident of a remote station, this level of closeness from a stranger would demand an immediate response. The grandmother's instinct to address it was not dramatic, but situationally appropriate. There are numerous examples across agricultural Australia that illustrate similar responses. Farmers routinely approach unknown vehicles that have driven too far onto private land, asking who the occupants are and why they are there. Graziers step outside with torches or tools when they hear voices near their sheds at night. Families on isolated properties are accustomed to confronting situations that urban dwellers might leave to authorities. These actions form part of the unwritten code of outback living. They are practical measures shaped by necessity and sustained by experience. For outsiders, especially those viewing the incident through a short online clip, these behaviors may seem abrupt. But for those who understand the rhythms of the outback, they are familiar. They signal a household maintaining its boundaries in the only way available to them. They also reflect a broader cultural expectation that visitors must respect property limits and that stepping beyond those limits without permission carries weight. This section does not attempt to assess the motives of the journalists or justify any parties involved. Its purpose is to clarify why crossing into a family's immediate space in remote Australia triggers a serious and immediate response. When viewed through the lens of outback norms, the grandmother's reaction fits within a long-established pattern of behavior grounded in safety and respect. The next section will continue by examining how official statements later clarified the practical context of the moment, shifting public understanding of what occurred on that veranda. When South Australia Police addressed the public in the days following the release of the veranda footage, their statements were measured, specific, and grounded in the practical realities of rural life. They did not comment on speculations circulating online. They did not attempt to interpret motives or respond to emotion. Instead, they focused squarely on the facts that could be verified, facts that, once outlined, shifted the way many people understood the moment captured in the clip. The most significant clarification made by Sapol was straightforward. A snake had been spotted on the veranda shortly before the grandmother appeared with the shotgun. The presence of snakes around homesteads in remote regions is neither unusual nor surprising, particularly in warm weather. They move quietly, using shade to regulate their body temperature, and often seek shelter close to homes where small gaps and warm surfaces provide ideal hiding places. In the outback, where medical assistance is distant and bites can be fatal, eliminating the threat quickly is a necessity, not an overreaction. Sapol confirmed that the firearm held by the grandmother was retrieved specifically to deal with that snake. The language used by the police was deliberate, avoiding embellishment while providing enough information to contextualize her actions. The statement read, in part, "The firearm was being used to deal with a snake." For those familiar with rural South Australia, this explanation aligned naturally with their understanding of daily life. The use of a shotgun in this situation reflected routine property management rather than confrontation. By clarifying the sequence of events, Sapol reinforced that the grandmother's actions were not directed at people. There was no intention to threaten the journalists who approached the veranda, nor did the grandmother position herself in a manner meant to escalate tension. The firearm happened to be in her hands at the same time the reporters moved closer to the house. This convergence of timing was unfortunate, but it did not indicate hostility. It reflected a moment where two separate activities intersected, her dealing with a wildlife threat and the reporters attempting to gain access to the family home. Sapol emphasized that there was no sign of deliberate intimidation. Their assessment was informed by statements from those present and by a clear understanding of how firearms are used on remote stations. The grandmother's posture, as described by police and those familiar with the setting, was consistent with someone addressing a practical problem rather than engaging in a confrontation. She held the shotgun with familiarity, not as a weapon directed at humans, but as a tool intended for a specific task. No charges were laid, and no further police action was considered necessary in relation to the firearm. This clarification also provided insight into the moment visible in the footage where the reporters stood unusually close to the veranda. Sapol acknowledged that the journalists were within the boundary of the private residence at the time. Their proximity coincided with the grandmother's emergence onto the veranda with the shotgun, creating a visual impression that did not reflect the operational reality. Police made it clear that the firearm and the journalist's presence were not connected by intention. One did not cause the other. Rather, they overlapped in a way that allowed outside observers to draw inaccurate conclusions. Understanding how snakes are dealt with in the outback helps explain why the grandmother acted as she did. Snakes do not announce themselves or offer time for deliberation. When they appear near a living area, the response must be prompt and decisive. For older residents, who may have dealt with similar situations many times before, the instinct is immediate. Retrieve the appropriate tool and remove the threat. This has little to do with emotion and everything to do with safety. The aim is to reduce risk to children, adults, and animals. A shotgun in this setting is simply the method chosen to ensure the snake cannot return to concealment. Sapol's confirmation helped reduce the intensity of public debate that had arisen after the video surfaced. Prior to the statement, much of the discussion online centered on assumptions made from the brief clip alone. People who lacked familiarity with rural Australian life attempted to interpret the scene through urban lenses, where firearms are associated with aggression or crisis. Police intervention provided a reality check. Their explanation grounded the moment in a factual context that required neither exaggeration nor speculation. The clarity offered by Sapol also highlighted the importance of understanding environment-specific behavior. What may look unusual to someone unfamiliar with the outback can be entirely commonplace to those who live there. A grandmother walking onto a veranda with a shotgun to deal with a snake is part of the natural rhythm of station life. The fact that this moment happened to coincide with the presence of an uninvited camera crew does not transform it into something else. It simply reveals how easily context can shift perception when a moment is captured without explanation. Another element addressed by SAPOL was the absence of threatening intent. Their officers interviewed those involved, reviewed available information, and concluded that the grandmother did not gesture, speak, or behave in a manner that suggested she intended harm to the reporters. Her verbal instruction to leave the property was consistent with the rights of a homeowner. The presence of the firearm, though visually striking in the footage, did not alter the nature of this instruction. It was a practical tool in hand, not a focal point of confrontation. In presenting their findings, SAPOL maintained a neutral tone.
They did not attempt to defend or criticize any party. Their role was to present facts and ensure that the public understood what had and had not occurred. By doing so, they provided the foundation on which the broader narrative could be understood. Their statement served as an anchor amidst the swirling speculation and emotional reactions online. It is important to note that SAPOL's clarification did not minimize the distress of the situation. They acknowledged the gravity of the ongoing search and the emotional toll borne by the family. However, they drew a clear line between emotional context and factual explanation. Their role was not to comment on personal strain, but to communicate what was known. This approach fostered a sense of relief for many viewers who felt uncertain about what the footage represented. With the facts laid out, the moment could be reframed. This section, therefore, stands not as a defense or an attempt to reinterpret the grandmother's actions, but as a plain account of what was confirmed by authorities. The presence of the snake, the use of the shotgun, the lack of intent directed at the journalists, and the circumstances of their proximity all contribute to a clearer understanding of the moment. The next section will expand on how media coverage and public interpretation evolved before and after these clarifications, influencing how the incident was perceived across Australia. As the search for the missing child stretched beyond the early days, media interest inevitably grew. What began as a local effort, supported by neighbouring stations and regional volunteers, soon became a story covered across state and national outlets. The prolonged uncertainty surrounding the child's disappearance created a vacuum that journalists sought to fill with updates, interviews, and visual coverage. Television crews traveled long distances to reach the property, prepared to document a situation that had already captured public attention. Their arrival, however, introduced a new layer of tension to a setting already strained by fear, exhaustion, and emotional fatigue. Journalists approaching a remote property are often unfamiliar with the unspoken rules of rural boundaries. In metropolitan environments, approaching the front of a house is routine. In the outback, where homes sit on vast landholdings, the family residence is not part of a suburban street, but a private sanctuary surrounded by open terrain. This difference in context is a source of friction, particularly when media crews, driven by deadlines and the need for footage, move closer than expected. Some reporters who arrived during the search crossed fences, gates, or natural boundary points in an attempt to reach the center of family activity. Their intention was to gather information. However, their actions placed them deeper into the private space of a household already dealing with immense emotional strain. The footage that later circulated online was recorded during one of these encounters. Its duration was brief, only a few seconds long, showing a moment that lacked any lead-up or follow-through. The camera captured the grandmother emerging from the house and issuing a clear instruction. But it did not capture the reporter's approach, the distance they had traveled beyond the expected entry point, or the fact that they were already standing close to the veranda. Without these missing details, the clip told only part of the story. It preserved the visible tension, but excluded the elements that shaped that tension, leaving viewers with a fragment rather than a full scene. The nature of short clips means that meaning can be easily distorted. When content is trimmed down to its most visually striking components, subtle cues disappear. In this case, the grandmother's tone, posture, and actions were presented without the surrounding context of the property layout, the build-up of media presence, or the ongoing stress of the search. Online platforms thrive on immediacy, and the clip circulated rapidly,
often uploaded and reshared without its original explanation. Each new share peeled away additional layers of information. Some versions of the video were shortened even further, removing her instruction to leave. Others were accompanied by captions written to provoke emotional reactions, drawing attention to the presence of the shotgun rather than the circumstances around it. Social media users who encountered the clip without context often reacted to the most visible element, the firearm. Without knowledge of the snake, the rural norms around firearms, or the position of the journalists, viewers filled the gaps with their own assumptions. Many interpretations leaned towards conflict because the image of an elderly woman holding a gun on her veranda is unfamiliar to those outside the outback. Some responses expressed concern for the safety of the reporters. Others questioned the behavior of the grandmother. Very few asked what might have been happening outside the camera frame or what events had led up to that moment. This pattern highlights how easily misunderstandings can spread when a situation is viewed from a distance. The public's engagement with missing person cases is often shaped by emotion. People invest hope and fear into every new detail, and when information is scarce, speculation grows. In this environment, a short clip can gain disproportionate influence. It becomes a reference point for discussions that stretch far beyond what the footage objectively shows. The process is not malicious. It reflects the way people attempt to make sense of disturbing events with limited information. However, without proper context, these interpretations can drift away from reality. Another factor contributing to misinterpretation was the difference between coverage from reputable news organizations and that from tabloid outlets. Established media generally approach missing person cases with caution, guided by ethical standards and an understanding of the impact their reporting can have on families. Their coverage tends to be measured, focusing on confirmed information provided by police and search agencies. In contrast, tabloid coverage often leans on visual impact, favoring images that attract attention regardless of their accuracy or completeness. This discrepancy was evident in how different organizations presented the veranda footage. While some outlets emphasized Sapol's clarification and the role of the snake, others prioritized the visual tension of the moment, placing the firearm at the center of their reporting. As these contrasting portrayals circulated online, the public faced conflicting narratives. Some viewers encountered balanced reporting that explained the police statements clearly. Others saw versions of the footage presented with sensational captions, encouraging an interpretation based on conflict rather than context. The chaotic nature of online sharing made it difficult for audiences to distinguish between responsible journalism and reductive storytelling. The same few seconds of footage took on multiple meanings depending on where and how it was presented. Even within social media discussions, the tone varied widely. Individuals with rural backgrounds often attempted to explain why the grandmother's behavior reflected practical station life. These comments sometimes clashed with responses from those who viewed the scene through urban frameworks, creating a divide not only between interpretations, but between cultural experiences. The moment became larger than the circumstances that produced it. In examining media behavior during this period, it is important to distinguish between intent and impact. Most journalists did not arrive at the property. Its purpose is to acknowledge the gap between what viewers saw and what was actually occurring, and to illustrate how easily misunderstandings can grow when information is limited. The next section will explore how broader cultural differences between urban and rural Australians further influenced these interpretations, adding yet another dimension to how the veranda moment was perceived. The moment captured on the veranda was not interpreted uniformly across Australia. Responses varied sharply depending on where viewers lived, what they were familiar with, and how they understood rural life. For many city-based Australians, the image of an elderly woman holding a shotgun was startling, prompting questions shaped by their own environments rather than by the realities of the outback. For those who have spent most of their lives in metropolitan settings, surrounded by dense suburbs, short distances, public services, and constant oversight, the behavior shown in the clip seemed unfamiliar, even confronting. This difference in understanding formed one of the clearest cultural divides in the public discussion. Urban Australians often view firearms through a narrow lens. In cities, guns are largely absent from everyday life. They appear in crime reporting, in emergency situations, or in highly regulated sporting contexts. The association is almost always linked to conflict or danger. As a result, when city viewers saw the grandmother standing with a shotgun, many automatically interpreted her posture as threatening or out of control. The presence of a weapon overshadowed everything else in the frame.
They saw an emotional situation amplified by the presence of a firearm, and because guns are so rarely encountered in their daily routines, the sight carried a weight that rural viewers did not assign to it. In contrast, for people living in regional and remote areas, the behavior in the footage did not appear extraordinary. Outback culture is shaped by distance, isolation, and the expectation that households must be self-reliant. Privacy is not only valued, but actively protected, partly because there are few external structures to maintain it. People manage their own safety, monitor their own boundaries, and respond to threats in ways that make sense for their environment. Firearms exist within this framework. They are rarely viewed as symbols of aggression. Instead, they form part of a toolkit used for practical tasks that urban communities may never encounter. This difference in cultural experience is essential to understanding the reaction to the clip. City viewers saw a weapon. Rural viewers saw a farm tool. Urban viewers saw confrontation. Rural viewers saw a moment of boundary management. Neither side was acting irrationally. They were simply interpreting the same image through different lived realities. The clip became a kind of mirror, reflecting the assumptions held by the people watching it. The outback fosters a very different relationship to privacy and self-protection. When a stranger approaches a home in a city, the resident may look through a peephole or call out from behind a door. They may feel cautious but not immediately threatened, because the presence of neighbours, street activity, and emergency services create a sense of collective security. In the outback, these safeguards do not exist in the same way. If someone approaches a home unexpectedly, the residents must determine on their own whether the person should be there. They act according to instinct and experience. This instinct includes a heightened sense of vigilance, an awareness that help is far away, and that delaying a response could carry consequences. Because of this cultural backdrop, the grandmother's behavior aligned with what many rural residents considered natural. She emerged to assess the situation, not to escalate it. Her demeanor was consistent with someone responding to a disturbance on their property during a stressful period. She did not behave erratically or with theatrics. She simply confronted what she perceived as a breach of space. For rural Australians, her actions resembled the routine way in which families on isolated landholdings manage unexpected visitors. There was nothing particularly unusual about the scene, other than its timing during an emotionally fraught search. International media further complicated the situation. Outlets from outside Australia often lacked the cultural context needed to interpret the footage accurately. Their reporting tended to emphasize the presence of the firearm because it aligned with dramatic narratives familiar to their audiences. Some international articles described the grandmother's behavior as threatening or hostile, not because the footage objectively demonstrated those qualities, but because such framing was recognizable to readers in countries where firearms are often associated with conflict. These narratives traveled quickly online, reinforcing misunderstandings among viewers who had no exposure to Australian rural practices. The distance between urban interpretation and rural reality also underscores how cultural assumptions shape reactions to trauma. When people encounter alarming footage, they often fill the gaps with their own internal logic. City viewers imagined scenarios that matched metropolitan fears: confrontation, aggression, volatility. Rural viewers imagined scenarios that matched their own experiences: property protection, wildlife management, self-reliance. The grandmother's behavior remained the same in both interpretations. Only the lens changed. This cultural divide became even more apparent in online discussions. People who grew up on farms or in regional towns frequently commented that the grandmother's behavior was typical of their own households.
Several pointed out that snakes on verandas were routine and that dealing with them quickly was a matter of safety rather than drama. Others highlighted that unfamiliar vehicles or strangers arriving unannounced could cause alarm, particularly during a crisis. These explanations were often met with disbelief or confusion from those without rural backgrounds, who found it difficult to reconcile the calm appearance of the grandmother with the presence of a gun. The contrast in perspectives does not suggest that one group was correct and the other mistaken. Instead, it reveals how the distance between urban and rural lifestyles can create misunderstandings. Each group reacted based on the context available to them. What the footage showed could not be fully understood without knowledge of the environment in which it was filmed. The grandmother's behavior was rooted in station life, where actions are shaped by necessity rather than perceived intent. She responded according to instincts developed over decades, instincts that prioritize protection, clarity, and immediate assessment of unfamiliar circumstances. Another dimension of the cultural divide relates to emotional expression. Urban viewers often expect emotional events to be accompanied by visible distress or dramatic gestures. But in the outback, emotional restraint is common, especially among older generations. Difficult experiences are often met with composure rather than outward displays of fear or anger. The grandmother's steady tone and calm command reflected this cultural pattern. She did not shout or panic. She gave a direct instruction. To audiences unfamiliar with this communication style, her restraint may have been misinterpreted as coldness or aggression. In reality, it was a manifestation of rural fortitude. The way the footage was framed by commentators also reinforced the divide. Some urban-based commentators viewed the moment as inherently alarming because it involved a firearm. People from regional areas countered that a shotgun on a veranda was no more unusual than a broom in a garage. The disagreement highlighted the broader reality that Australia is not a culturally uniform nation. Experiences of space, risk, and autonomy vary significantly across regions, and these differences influence how events are interpreted. This section examines the cultural gap not to place blame or to highlight division, but to clarify why perceptions differed so widely. Understanding these differences is key to recognizing how a short clip recorded in a specific environment can generate reactions that diverge from the situation's reality. The next part will shift focus from cultural interpretation to the emotional weight carried by the family, exploring how the grandmother's role placed her in a position of heightened responsibility during an already devastating time. In the days following the disappearance of a child, time moves differently for the families left waiting. Hours feel longer. Silence feels heavier. Those at the center of such an ordeal often describe the experience as living inside a fog, one that dulls their ability to rest, to think clearly, or to maintain any sense of normal routine. For the grandmother in this case, the emotional weight of the situation was compounded by years of being the steady figure within the household. Her instinct would have been to remain composed for the sake of others, even as her internal world fractured under the strain. Exhaustion settles into the body quietly. It is visible in the way a person walks, the way they hold their shoulders, the way they pause before speaking. For someone of her age, sleep deprivation and constant vigilance take an even greater toll. The nights following the child's disappearance would not have allowed for deep rest. The mind remains alert, replaying moments, wondering whether something could have been missed or whether another search area should be checked. Sleep becomes fragmented, broken by sudden waking, each time prompted by the same looping thought. What if a sign is out there and she has not seen it yet? Such exhaustion does not express itself loudly. It often appears as quiet withdrawal, as reduced patience, as a tightening of the jaw, or a distant look in the eyes. In the footage captured earlier, the grandmother's expression carried this quiet strain. It was not dramatic, nor was it outwardly chaotic. It reflected the tiredness of someone who had spent days trying to manage fear without allowing it to overwhelm those around her. This form of emotional endurance is common among older family members in missing person cases. They feel a responsibility to remain upright when others are falling apart. Fear, however, does not lessen simply because one chooses restraint. The fear of losing a grandchild is unlike other fears. It settles deep within the chest. It creates a physical ache that cannot be soothed. The grandmother would have felt this constantly, an ache sharpened by uncertainty, by the harsh reality of the land around the property, and by the knowledge that the child's parents were themselves struggling to cope. In many families, particularly in rural communities, older women often absorb emotional burdens quietly. They act as a buffer, shielding younger relatives from the full weight of distress. In this case, the grandmother's role would have expanded beyond her usual responsibilities, placing her in a position where she carried both her own fear and the fear of those who depended on her. This internal pressure intensified whenever unfamiliar people approached the home. When strangers arrive during a crisis, the instinct to protect becomes stronger, not weaker. The grandmother's protective tendencies were shaped by decades of rural living, decades of understanding that it falls upon the household to determine who enters their space and under what circumstances. Even without the presence of a firearm, her reaction to unknown visitors would likely have been immediate. The difference was that she met them during a moment when her emotional reserves were already depleted. Cameras close to a private home create a sense of intrusion that is difficult to articulate. The presence of a lens, especially one held by someone she did not know, can feel overwhelming. Cameras capture moments without offering support. They observe distress without easing it. For someone who is vulnerable and exhausted, having a camera pushed towards the veranda is not simply uncomfortable. It can feel threatening, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional one. It erodes what little privacy remains. It forces a person into visibility at a time when they are struggling to maintain their footing. Compounding this pressure was the rapid spread of speculation online. As the clip circulated, comments emerged from people who knew nothing of the family's reality. Some questioned behavior they did not understand. Some drew conclusions based on incomplete information. For the grandmother, these external judgments would have added a new layer of distress. Being misunderstood is painful in any situation. Being misunderstood while searching for a missing child is an added cruelty. She may have been aware of some of the commentary, either through others telling her, or through the sense that the world outside the station was forming opinions about her actions. This awareness contributes to a state of emotional siege, where pressure comes not only from the event itself, but from the narratives imposed by outsiders. Her reluctance to speak publicly is easily understood through this lens. During moments of acute distress, people fear saying the wrong thing, not because they have anything to hide, but because they are aware that every word will be scrutinized. The grandmother would have known that her emotional state made clarity difficult. She may have feared being misquoted, misinterpreted, or criticized further. Speaking to strangers while in such a fragile state can feel impossible. Silence, in these circumstances, is not avoidance. It is self-preservation. Her behavior can also be viewed through the dynamics inside the home. With the child's parents overwhelmed and struggling under the weight of their own fear, the grandmother carried an involuntary responsibility to stabilize the household. She would have been the one others looked to for guidance, for quiet reassurance, for the practical organization that keeps a family functional during crisis. This burden falls heavily on older women in rural families, and while they often rise to the challenge, the emotional cost is significant. When the journalists approached the house that day, her reaction, swift, firm, and instinctive, was shaped by this burden. She was dealing with a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a powerful drive to protect the family's last refuge of privacy. She responded not as someone seeking attention or hostility, but as someone whose emotional capacity had been stretched thin. The moment the camera appeared in front of her home, her protective instinct activated immediately. There was no time for calculation or diplomacy. There was only the urge to shield her family from further intrusion. Her posture in the footage reflected this instinct. She did not appear confused or unstable. She seemed decisive in a way that older rural women often are when faced with situations that require immediate boundaries. Her voice carried the clarity of someone who had been pushed beyond her emotional threshold, but whose duty to protect remained unwavering. This form of protective behavior can be misinterpreted by those unfamiliar with the emotional context, yet it makes sense when viewed within the isolation and strain the family faced. This section focuses solely on the grandmother's internal experience and the pressures that shaped her reaction. It does not speculate on external events or interpret her actions beyond the emotional framework available. The next part will shift attention to the broader consequences of the footage's prominence, exploring how the veranda moment changed the direction of public conversation and overshadowed key aspects of the ongoing investigation. As coverage of the veranda moment intensified, the public conversation surrounding the case shifted in a way that few could have predicted. A short piece of footage, captured in seconds, stripped of context and widely circulated, became the central point of discussion. It eclipsed the broader purpose of the search, drawing focus away from the missing child and instead directing national attention onto an isolated moment involving his grandmother. What began as a local tragedy gradually became entangled in commentary that concentrated more on the image of a firearm than on the urgent question of where the child had gone. This shift occurred slowly at first. Early comments online revealed confusion and curiosity, but as the clip spread further, its influence grew disproportionately to its actual significance. The story began appearing in headlines and social media feeds framed around the firearm rather than the disappearance. The visual element of the clip, the grandmother standing on the veranda holding a shotgun, was striking enough to become the dominant reference point for many viewers who had not followed the case closely. For them, this was the first and most memorable piece of information they encountered, and it shaped their understanding of the entire situation. The tragedy of this narrative drift is clear. While the primary concern should have remained the search for the missing child, the public's attention became divided. The more the clip circulated, the more new viewers encountered the story not through updates from police or search teams, but through this single, decontextualized video. Discussions began to revolve around the grandmother's behavior rather than the uncertainty and urgency that defined the wider investigation. The disappearance itself, its heartbreak, its unanswered questions, and its impact on the family was pushed aside as people debated interpretations of the clip. For the family, this shift would have been deeply painful. Missing person cases bring immense emotional strain, and families rely on community understanding and support to endure the long days and nights without answers. When attention drifts away from the child and focuses instead on peripheral incidents, it can feel as though the gravity of their loss is being diminished. For the grandmother, the realization that her moment on the veranda had become a public spectacle would have carried its own emotional burden. She had acted under pressure, driven by fatigue and fear, yet the world outside the station interpreted her actions through screens and commentary rather than through empathy. The child's parents were also affected by this shift in focus. They were in the midst of their own anguish, navigating the terrifying possibility of never learning what happened to their son. As public discourse drifted towards the veranda footage, they found themselves caught in a secondary spotlight they never sought. The family, already fragile, had to grapple not only with uncertainty about the child, but with thousands of strangers analyzing a moment that had nothing to do with the search itself. This secondary scrutiny adds layers of emotional weight that are rarely acknowledged. Missing person crises are already overwhelming. When misinformation or misdirected attention enters the picture, the emotional strain becomes even more pronounced. For many local residents familiar with the realities of rural life, the disproportionate focus on the clip felt misguided. People in the region understood the cultural context of the grandmother's behavior. They knew the relationship between firearms and everyday station work. They recognized the emotional state of families under stress and the instinct to protect personal space during a crisis. Their comments reflected a sense of frustration at seeing the narrative turn away from the missing child and towards something unrelated to the core issue. Some described the media's focus as off-target or missing the point, noting that the real tragedy had nothing to do with the scene shown in the footage. This sense of misalignment was echoed in conversations throughout regional communities. Local residents spoke quietly among themselves, expressing concern that outsiders, particularly those unfamiliar with outback culture, were treating the clip as evidence of something deeper. The reality, they felt, was far simpler. The grandmother had acted as many rural residents would, only at a time when cameras were present. To them, the heart of the story was the child, not the fleeting moment that distracted so many. Despite these sentiments, the public narrative remained heavily influenced by the footage. In digital spaces, attention gravitates toward images that produce strong reactions. The image of a grandmother holding a shotgun triggered emotional and cultural responses that overshadowed the less visually dramatic reality of the ongoing search. The tragedy is that visual impact often outcompetes factual importance. While police continued their efforts, while volunteers combed through harsh terrain, while the family hoped desperately for any sign of the child, much of the online conversation centered on a moment that had no bearing on where the boy might be or what had happened to him. This tension between appearance and reality is common in high-profile cases, but it is particularly stark here.
The clip became an anchor point for speculation, drawing attention away from the question that should have remained central. Where was the missing child? Each new comment, each repost, and each misinterpretation created further distance from the core issue. The more the clip spread, the more it obscured the fact that the investigation remained unresolved. In some cases, viewers who encountered the story through the clip never realized that the child had not been found. Their engagement began and ended with the image of the firearm. The emotional consequences of this shift are profound. When public focus strays from the missing child, the family often feels abandoned or misunderstood. They may feel that the world has become distracted from what matters, leaving them alone with their fear, while others debate imagery detached from the true crisis. The grandmother, who was already carrying significant emotional strain, became the subject of discussions that had little connection to the loss she was enduring. These conversations added a layer of public pressure at a time when she was already depleted. Local communities, particularly those familiar with the geography and conditions of the search area, also expressed sadness at this drift. To them, the clip was a footnote, a moment recorded during an immense search effort. They watched as attention shifted unjustifiably, overshadowing the efforts of volunteers, police, and neighbors who continued to search the land. Many felt that the focus on the grandmother's behavior detracted from the visibility needed to keep the child's case alive in the public eye. The core truth, however, remains unaltered. The child had not been located. No fragment of the veranda clip offered insight into his whereabouts. No aspect of the footage provided clues that could assist search teams or guide police assessments. The attention given to the clip was out of alignment with its relevance. The real issue, the disappearance itself, remained unresolved, unanswered, and overshadowed. This section exists to underscore that imbalance. It recognizes the sadness inherent in watching public attention drift away from the central tragedy towards something incidental. The next part will focus on grounding the narrative again, drawing the conversation back to the broader perspective required to understand the case responsibly, and reaffirming the importance of context when approaching moments that attract widespread attention. In the aftermath of any high-profile incident, especially one unfolding in a remote part of the country, there is a natural tendency for conversations to grow around the fragments of information that reach the public first. Short clips, isolated images, and rapid commentary can give shape to a narrative long before the facts have had the chance to settle. As the discussion surrounding the veranda moment evolved, it became increasingly clear that the broader context needed to be restored. Without it, interpretations drifted far from the realities of life in the outback and from the core concern of the case. Understanding behavior in remote Australia requires an appreciation for the conditions under which families live, work, and respond to events. The land demands a certain level of vigilance. People manage threats directly because support is distant. Noise on the veranda is not dismissed, it is investigated. Boundaries are not symbolic,
they are necessary. Tools are not viewed for their symbolic meaning, they are used because they perform a function. When seen through this lens, the grandmother's actions form part of the everyday rhythm of station life, rather than an extraordinary response to the presence of outsiders. The difficulty arises when viewers attempt to interpret outback behavior through metropolitan assumptions. A few seconds of footage, viewed without context, can easily be mistaken for something it is not. This is not a failing of the viewer, but a reminder of how different environments shape expectations and instincts. Behavior that appears abrupt or unusual to city-based audiences may be entirely ordinary in a rural setting. The veranda moment, when examined within its environment, aligns with the practical, self-reliant nature of remote households rather than with confrontation. For this reason, it becomes important to resist forming conclusions based on isolated visual cues. The clip circulated widely, but its length and lack of background meant it could not support any definitive interpretation. It captured a single action, not the conditions surrounding it. It showed a moment in motion, not the hours of strain, exhaustion, and emotional upheaval that preceded it. To treat the clip as evidence of anything beyond that moment is to overlook the complexities of the situation. When examining the grandmother's role in the broader context of the case, the facts remain straightforward. She was not a suspect. She was not considered by police to be involved in the child's disappearance. Her presence in the footage reflects her position in the household as someone who responded to activity near the home during a deeply stressful time. Police statements described her as a witness to events, not as someone under scrutiny. Any interpretation that suggested otherwise did not come from official information, but from speculation born of the clip's circulation. When placed within this framework, her behavior becomes easily understood. She was balancing trauma, fatigue, and the instinct to protect her family. She acted according to the environment she lived in, and in alignment with the expectations of outback households. Her response was shaped by responsibility, not aggression. It reflected the demands of isolation, not confrontation. With these contextual elements restored, the veranda moment becomes what it truly is: a fragment of a much larger, much heavier reality, not a defining indicator of character or intent. The public's challenge is to maintain clarity when information spreads quickly and incomplete moments take on disproportionate significance. Digital platforms encourage rapid reactions and simplified narratives. Yet, in situations involving families under distress, this speed can distort rather than illuminate. A calm, grounded approach is required, not only to honor the lived experience of those directly affected, but to ensure that attention remains focused on the aspects of a case that truly matter. It is essential for viewers to pause before forming conclusions, to consider where the footage was taken, who was involved, and how rural life shapes behavior differently to urban environments. This type of caution is not only respectful, but necessary. Lives in remote Australia operate under circumstances that many Australians never experience. When those circumstances intersect with national attention, the risk of misunderstanding grows. The responsibility to interpret events thoughtfully falls not only on the media, but on the audience consuming their material. The veranda moment reminds us that context must guide interpretation, not assumption. As the conversation turns back to the wider case, the central truth remains unchanged. A child is missing. The landscape holds its silence. The days that followed brought no immediate resolution, no confirmed answers, and no clear path toward closure. Family caught in such situations describe this silence as its own form of torment, an absence that echoes louder than any piece of footage or commentary. It is a silence that stretches across the plains, into the homestead, and through every attempt to maintain hope. The veranda clip, for all the attention it received, does not speak to the whereabouts of the child or to what happened on the day he disappeared. It does not offer insight into the search, nor does it provide clues that could assist in understanding the case's direction. Its prominence is a reminder of how easily the public conversation can drift. The real issue remains unresolved, and the uncertainty is a burden borne most heavily by the family left waiting. In drawing this narrative to its close, it is important to return to the broader perspective. Behaviour in remote Australia is shaped by a way of life that prioritises practicality, privacy, and protection. Moments captured on camera, no matter how compelling, must be understood within that framework. The grandmother's role in the footage is best viewed through the lens of her environment, her responsibilities, and her emotional state at the time, not through assumptions informed by unfamiliar contexts. The story of the veranda moment encourages viewers to approach information with care, to recognize the influence of environment on behavior, and to resist the pull of quick interpretations. It urges us to stay mindful of how easily focus can drift from what truly matters. And it invites us to acknowledge that some questions remain unanswered, not because they are ignored, but because the land where they were born holds its secrets closely. As the dust settles on the discussions sparked by the clip, one question lingers quietly beneath the surface. Where is the missing child, and what truth lies hidden in the stillness of the outback? It is a question that cannot be answered by a fragment of footage. It belongs to the landscape, the investigation, and the passage of time, elements far larger than any moment captured on a veranda.